And I'd like to thank Ishata as well for having us join this group and doing this presentation. So thank you for that. I'm going to start off real quick, just giving you a quick little breakdown of our company and how we started, and then I'll get into the presentation. I'll be very brief about that. So we're Icon1 Communication. We've been in this industry for some 20 odd years. We started off developing websites from our mom's basement. So we're a full bootstrap company. Started by myself, and then soon after that, we started developing custom applications for our clients. People that we're meeting kept asking us if we can do this type of work, and so we slowly got tossed into developing applications. From thereafter, we were introduced into the event space and became involved in event applications with clients such as Intel, BlackBerry at the time, and then started focusing our efforts in that space for the last 15 years. So we became very involved in the event space. At the same time, just to give you a little breakdown, as we were doing that, we were still building custom applications for people, for clients, not related to the event space, which was good because it allowed us to continuously learn and also challenge ourselves to some of the problem solving. Because every client that came to us with a problem, so we had to solve that. So that helped us build our capabilities and also learn how to problem solve a lot of the issues that they had and provide them with an application that would work. Today, we're a growing company. We service a lot of Fortune 500 companies, and we're working on our next evolution of products that we want to bring to the market. And with that, I just want to say again, I'm very happy to be on this workshop. I hope that this is informative and you guys get something out of this. So I'll go on with this presentation. Before I start with UI UX design, I thought we'd take a little small, quick journey in time. When I started this industry, this is what we had to work with. Windows 95, and this was the kind of UI that we had to work with and see. And as you can see over time, the UI, the capabilities of interfacing, the data that we get to see and access obviously evolved to a point that we can do a lot more in today's time, right? But this is what we have to work with, and this is what you guys get to work with. So you guys are coming in a great time because the technology is just evolving at an incredible pace, right? Just again, going through that journey, think about Amazon. This is what they would show, and this is what they're showing today. And why this is important, I think, for you programmers out there is because back then we were very limited in what we could do just due to technology and capabilities. Where now you guys have a lot more capabilities, a lot more tools available to you. And more importantly, data is allowing you to do a lot more things. And as technology advances, so will your capabilities, your UIs, and the things that you develop. And so that's very important to keep in mind on how we move forward in this next day and age, right? Especially as now we're moving into more data transfer and things like that. Still like showing you a couple of examples, and I'm almost done here. When you look at Salesforce, I'm sure everyone heard of Salesforce. This is what their system looked like. And so from a programmer's perspective, when they were building this is what they were, pumping out, right? A system with a lot of information, clunky, and I'd say very ugly. But in today's day and age, this is what they're seeing, right? This is what they're coming up with. And what's important here to look at these differences is that it's about presenting your information as quickly as possible to your end user, giving them access to information that they need immediately without being so clunky. And this is very important when you guys are developing and thinking of UI or building out modules, right? You could be building a whole application. You could be building a small module for an application. And so you should always think about, making it simple, making it, clear, and presenting your data very clear to the end user. Once again, when I started, everyone, we had to build websites under, 53 kilobytes per page. So could you imagine, right? I mean, this was what we had to work with. So you guys and everyone on this call can obviously do a lot more, right? And again, just want to, again, talk about this past, how the past, is important for what we're moving forward to, because we don't know what the next 20 years is going to bring us. A very good example of this, if I'm not sure if people have seen this, if not, it's a very famous picture taken when Pope Benedict was brought in. And you can see in 2005, no smartphones, right? Where in 2013, when the next Pope came in, everyone was wearing or had a smartphone. And so why is this important? Because as technology comes around or changes, so does our habits, so do the things that we develop. So as we advance, so do more options. And the other important part is how do we leverage these new technologies? In this case, smartphones, and what do you develop for it? This gave birth to Instagram, Facebook for social media. Just think about how much more you can do with your phone. Certainly, when I had a phone, I couldn't do any of these things. Just to put things in perspective, and this is the last slide. When they went to the moon, this is what they had to work with. 2 megahertz CPU and 4 kilobyte worth of RAM. There's more power in a smartwatch than there was in what they used to go to the moon, which makes you kind of wonder if they would have gone to the moon knowing this today. So things are moving quick. Technology is moving quick. And so when you're programming and developing, these are all important aspects of your thought process, and you have to keep up with all this. Okay, so again, why does this matter? Obviously, you could do a lot more than before. Technology will continue to advance, allowing more capabilities. Keeping up with new technologies can be hard, but necessary. We attend a lot of events. Clients of ours ask us to do some things. So we're lucky to go to places like supercomputing. And the things that they're talking about there are so ahead of us that we don't even understand it in some cases. But they're building like the next generation of CPUs, the next generation of RAM, the next generation of VR, all that kind of stuff, right? So identifying how to use and apply different technologies is important. That's going to be a daunting task because there's so much of it now out there. So you're going to have to really look and learn and think about how this stuff applies, especially as new apps and new development occurs. How do you leverage these technology in your application, Owen, is also important. Again, very difficult nowadays, but there's just so many options, so many different programming codes that you can use. And kind of pick one and work with it and then evolve it from there. Again, anyone with a smart device can access your application. Anyone with a smart device or computer is your audience. And what is that audience? Right now, it's 3 billion people. So I highlight this because as the next generation of programmers, when we started off, our reach was very small. Whereas you guys now, you can access information and send out information instantaneously to the world, right? And so this is why it's important. So how does this apply, in planning your application and UI and UX design? Well, in many ways, really. One, first of all, you have to really define your application and know who your users are. I'm not sure how many systems or applications you developed or modules you may have worked on, but knowing this is the key to what you're developing. A lot of times when we work with people, this is not a really clear, defined scope. So defining your application is very key. What are you trying to achieve with your application? Who is your audience? Very important. So I know you're doing a hackathon on the food bank. So this is your audience, but within that, there's very specific targeted audience, the front end user, the back end user, and maybe even the admin. So when you're thinking about building your systems and applications, you have to think about those users. You have to think about what you're building. Can they work with it? Are they an older audience, a younger audience? And how do you keep it simple? What is the problem you're trying to solve for your clients or systems you're building? Again, at the end of the day, everything we do is the value is in solving a problem, right? And so that's what you're working on, and you should think of it that way. Always keep in mind the user when you're planning your application and UI design. A lot of times the programs we work with, they present us with some things that are just, it's cool, but it's not user friendly and people can't work with it, or there's just too much information. People don't want to see an application that looks like this, right? They want to see something that's very clean and easy to use. So this is very important. And when we work with our developers, we try and keep them aligned in that, hey, keep it simple. give it to 1 to 2 clicks. That's what we want to see. So how do you go about planning it? What are the key elements in building your application? Uh, Very important. How will your interface function? What are the elements it will require? And so what I mean by that is if you're building an application, you have to really focus on the functionality of that system. What are you trying to achieve with it? And then what elements within that application do you need to present in a way that people can use it? And so this is very key, because if you can't do that, then your application is rendered not useful. So also, are there any interactive areas of the system, such as call to actions or gestures, if you're working on mobile apps? Good example of this would be, let's say, Tinder, right? Where you're swiping left, right, if you like them or don't like them. So it's just a quick, simple action. But on an application, let's say a web-based application, you have less of that. But again, you need to think about that when you're developing. Planning your informational architecture. This is also very important. How you plan for that information to flow from start to finish as people come into your system. When they log in, what do they see? How do they access information, input information? What are you collecting? Do you make it easy for them to collect it? And I'll show you some examples of this. So it's not just all text-based here, but I'll show you some examples. Also, as you're doing that, and I'm not sure if how skilled you are with design or not, but you should be thinking about your UI look and feel. And if you're not a designer, then you can work with a designer. At the very least, what you could do is also just create some, wireframe sketches of how you think your system should work, and that will, make it a lot easier for people to work with you. So again, plan your navigation. If you're building a system, you need to know how to navigate through it. Minimize the amount of icons that you might be using. What are the key functions? Input controls such as button toggles and checkboxes. And then in some cases, toggles and checkboxes can give you a subset of actions. And those actions can make it more easier for people to use that system. Always keep the information together. Keep relative information together so users have access to the areas of your system that are most important. Give you an example. We're building a system for a client, and they deal with speakers. So if I'm looking for speakers, I want to keep all that information relative. If I'm doing a search for speakers, or if I'm looking for a specific criteria on that speaker, we want to keep that information together. But also, if there's any actions, if I want to send an email to that speaker, or if I want to learn more about them, we try and keep it all together. Also, keeping your colors and icons that are, easy to use and visualize, and you want to draw attention to your application or specific areas of your application. This is very important, because if people are wandering through your application, you lose them, right? You want to, present your UI in a way that it's easy for them to click on things, get to certain areas of your application fairly easy. And always keep your users engaged by making sure that you keep the content specific to that area. When you're building your system, an area that a lot of people kind of skip through is research. We always spend a lot of time researching our competitors. We research, even if it's not a direct competitor, we research some UI components and seeing how they do things. We find it that in some cases, we like what they're doing as a UI, and we want to implement it into our designs, but we just have to apply it according to the information that we're presenting. So research. Before you start building your application, you should always research. Analyze the applications to learn any key functions, areas of interest, how the data flows, how the interface is designed. Keep going from there. Once you complete a list of your areas of functions, your applications, you can start mapping out your application and building a workflow. And workflows can look like this. Without a workflow, your application is really kind of dead in the water, because this will help you save time, money, especially when you're programming your system. You want to be able to know the key areas of your system. And I have a few different examples of workflows. So this is a more complicated workflow when it comes to the UI. This kind of breaks down all the areas of this one system that we built. This is a more high-level example of how we were capturing data from a registration site between multiple registration systems. And so we had to kind of think about how would this work? How will the information be presented? And so on. And then how, at the end of the day, we were doing registration desks too. So all this had to flow into one system. So again, workflows are important. More examples of a workflow. This one is a bit more clearer and maybe easier to understand. People will, you log into the system, you create your event, and then from here, again, this is what I'm trying to show here is essentially when you're entering information, if there's any notifications, how the notifications would work, how they would interact. And again, that would apply into your UI and design and information part of your development. Yeah, I'm going to open it up for any questions. If anyone has any questions right now, I can take a quick break here and respond to any questions. Okay. So again, once you have your workflow, you can plan your interface. Having a detailed workflow makes the planning your interface design a lot easier. Depending on the applications you're developing, you might need multiple interface designs. Mobile applications flow differently than and have different style guides than a desktop responsive application. All key components of your application should be included in your design. This is where you can look at the technologies you want to use in the development of your interface to make it more user-friendly. And always keep your interface simple and find ways to minimize the amount of clicks a user has to take to get to the information. No one likes to have to click 3 times to get to something. I'll give you an example. We were working on a system, and we wanted to get the user to get to the information in just 1 click. So we had to develop a UI where from the drop down, they can just easily click on the icon, which basically takes them to that subsection, and then access that event and that information with 1 click. And so, that took some time to develop and think it through. The thought process behind it took some time, but it saved us a lot of time afterwards in developing it. So mockups, once you've created your workflows, you go into your mockups, right? And, you can't create a mockup unless you have your workflows. Again, because without this, you can't build a mockup. You can't build a design. And if you do, you're going to have problems. We've been doing this for a long time, and we always start with workflows. Sometimes, 6, 7 different types of workflows that you then do A/B testing with your clients as well with some of those until you refine the workflow, and then you go into the design and development of your mockups. So again, once you identify the objectives of your application and completed a workflow document, you start planning all the components that make up your application design. So creating a mockup for all the major areas of your system, is focusing on the functionality. This will help you visualize how the system will look and function. If you're not a designer, you can just use a simple wireframe, like something as simple as this or even simpler, right? Someone's asking a question here, how long you should spend on mockups. Look, the time on mockups, we can spend days on mockups. It really depends on the complexity of the application. We spend a lot of time on the workflows because that really kind of sets the tone for your mockups. Then once you build your mockups, you would then look at that and show it to your client or to your group and see if that makes sense. A lot of times in our mockups, what we find is we miss things, or there's things that we thought were going to be good that don't make sense, because you can actually visually see from start to finish how your system will flow, right? Just again, think about Instagram, how easy of a system that is. A couple of clicks and you get to post a picture, right? So mockups can take a small period of time or a very lengthy period of time, depending on how big your application is going to be. Give you an example. One of our systems we're developing has about 20 different mockups because it's that big of a system. Again, this all helps with the programming and development of your application. So if you're programming it and you have a mockup, it makes it easier because then you know exactly what you're developing. So once again, I know you're working on this food bank application hackathon. When you're thinking about this, you should be thinking, who's the end user? What's the information I want to present? How would they interact with that? And how would this look? And in your mockup, you can kind of visualize these things. And then from a programming perspective, you can say, okay, that will work or that won't make sense. If you just jump into programming, you're going to find that you're going to run into problems. So here's some applications that we developed. I apologize that we had to blur out the screenshots because it's real data and we can't show that. But in this system, it looks simple, but there's a lot of things happening here. So we wanted to develop a system that was very simple, user-friendly, and minimal. So we had a very top level navigation. Anything you clicked on the top navigation would also reflect on your left nav. We built subsequent modules that would go within these, okay? And each of these was just to basically, guide the user and keep it very simple. This is a system that manages demonstrations that they would submit. So the way this would work is we have to figure out how to get people to submit these demos. So there's a whole component to this and how they submit it, which is the data you're collecting, which I'll just jump to that real quick. So this is the data you're collecting. Again, every system starts with, what are you collecting? Think about Facebook. At the end of the day, Facebook is collecting the profile about yourself and then pictures. And then from there, they spawn off and start creating all these other cool features. But without the core data, you don't have anything. So in this case, this demo that we're collecting, this is the core data. And from here, we're able to do many different things. So this is what we're collecting. This is how we're presenting it. So these are like thumbnails or tiles, as we call them. The modules up here, if you kind of can see it, would be being able to filter by these, importing the data. So we give them the ability to import through an Excel file, which basically maps to the data set, the data field. So basically all this is mapped. And then this is where you start building these controls, right? You click on import. You download an Excel file with the data set in there. You would then upload that and it would capture all your data. And then we do all the validations, right? Did the data go in correctly? Was there any errors? Did it capture your, if you upload 14 lines of code or 14 lines of demos, did they all get captured correctly? So that's part of those modules. And this was all in that workflow, the document that we were talking about earlier. Searching and adding. So then we created like notifications. So anytime someone comes into the system and uploads something, we do this notification. So any new user coming into the system would know that something new was added. And that was kind of a cool feature because there's a lot of demos going in here. And so you want to know what the latest ones were. Also, more importantly, was this left navigation. In here, you can do like your WIP, work in progress, my demos, and so on. You can do a call for demos, which you can basically collect more demos. So this is all part of that mocking up that I was referring to earlier. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more here. Excuse me. So you really need to think about your navigation, and your navigation does not have to be complex. In fact, I think you should keep it simple, because the more complex it is, then people might get lost in it. But if you can do a few things with the few clicks and get your users into that area, that's just the best option. So when we thought about navigation, this is what our navigation was going to look like, and we focused on that. And then we started thinking about these little modules. What do they look like? And how do we access these modules? And as programmers, this is what you'd be developing, right? These modules, these flyouts, these cool transitions between the clicks and things like that, and then showing the data. And it might look simple, but as you start developing this, you start finding all sorts of problems, which we did. We found quite a bit of problems being able to present the data in a way that we liked. So if you don't plan it, you're going to run into a lot of problems. So again, these modules are from here. So basically, you can click on this flyout and you can do the filtering. You can minimize these. You can sort this. And then another thing that's cool is you should always think about giving your users different views, different ways of seeing the data. And so when we work with our designers, we say, okay, we're presenting all this data. How else can we show this data? Can we do it in a list view? And if I'm doing it in a list view, well, how much of the data can I show? So in this case, we had to give the ability, because we're collecting so much lines of related to that one line item or one demo, the ability for them to control what they turn on and off. So they can actually hide certain columns, add different columns, export this data into a PowerPoint. So it takes it all and then exports it into a PowerPoint, presents the data nicely for them to look at. So again, when you're thinking of a bigger system and then these subsequent smaller modules, they can be very time consuming. But if you do a good job of it and are able to present it properly, then people tend to use it more, and you get more buy-in from the people using it. Other key things to think of is when you're doing these controls, right? If you're doing like a checkbox and things like that, well, these are cool options when you're thinking of it, because I can click this checkbox and I can create a whole subset of other actions that the user can take, right? And so it keeps everything clean until they perform this action of clicking on this checkbox, right? And so you should think about that when you're developing your systems. Again, how do you present other actions or subsequent actions in your systems and in your UI ultimately, right? Because we want to do a lot of things here, and we did not want to show all these buttons at the top of the system unless they clicked on something. More importantly, we wanted to give them the ability to filter things and control what they see at any given time. So again, when you're thinking about your UI, think about these areas, right? Does anyone have any questions regarding some of these areas of your interface and UI? Okay.
Just a question about the workflow. So like the workflow is just basically like how your application works and the steps through it, right?
Well, again, like if you look at this workflow, and I'm not sure who's that speaking. Sorry, just so.
Me, Cryptonics.
Cryptonics. Okay. Well, when you're building your workflow, depending on how complex your system is, it's more about understanding how everything flows, right? In this system that we're building here, there's integration points. We're looking at it from a couple of different perspectives. The user coming into the system, right? What do they see and what do they access and what can they do, right? Then you're looking at it from the admin point of view. As an admin, what do you want to do? What information do you have access to? What can you do with it? What information can you upload? What can you export? If there's integration points, how do they integrate? Any reporting that you want to do. So the workflow is on a large system. Can be complex, and you want to think out all these points, because when you design it, you can see it's easier to design that system, right? And to think of your functionality and programming on a simpler workflow like this one. This is just kind of guiding through the process of how something is accessed, when the admin gets to see it, and when they get to do approvals, and how like a notification would be sent out, right? So that does that answer your question, or do you want me to go a bit more in depth on some workflows? Because there's different types of workflows. Ones that we're not getting into too are like security workflows, right? When you're building your applications, like dual authentication, sending out an email. So if someone logs into your system or signs up, you send out that email notification for them to validate that email. So things like that also can be part of your workflow, right? Depending on how complicated your system is.
Okay, thank you very much. That cleared up a lot.
So there's a question here about the hackathon, and let me see here what it says. Well, I mean, in your hackathon, you're right. You can't get user feedback, but in your group, you can do user feedback, right? You can think about when you do these mockups or workflows between the group, you can start brainstorming. Does that make sense, or does that not make sense? And since you only have 36 hours in your hackathon, I think it's very important that you spend time in your workflow, because if you spend like 3 or 4 hours on your workflow, ultimately then you know exactly what you're developing and building. again, even if it's something as simple as this, you can all break out and develop components of your system and then stitch it together. So I would certainly, develop a workflow frame on it, even if it's a basic one. And then between your group, if it's a few people, just say, does that make sense? How do you think about that? And get some feedback between each other, and then go to bat and start putting that together, right? So I'm gonna jump into another system that we built, and I'll explain some of our workflow and UI in this one. It's a bit of a simpler system, and I can show it. This is a conference portal that we built for our clients. And it's again, seems simple, and that's the key, right? You want it to look simple. You want it to be a few clicks, but in the background, you want to make sure that your engine is working and pumping out this information. Sorry, I'm just reading a question here. So in this example here, I'm just going to do this quick case study, and then maybe I'll open up to questions and stop presenting. But in this example here, what we're trying to do is we're building a conference portal where a user can. So there's a conference, and we're collecting all this information from sponsors. So we can have 30, 50, or even 100 sponsors. And so we're collecting all this information on the sponsor, like basic stuff like their logo, their company description, and contact information. That would be one deliverable, as we would call it. And so the point was where you had all these sponsors coming in. And so the problem here was, again, going back to defining the solution, the problem was they had all these sponsors, and all this was done through Excel. And they wanted a system where they can have all these sponsors come in through one portal, one login, and then be able to submit all this information, and where the admins then can look at all that information, extract it, and then use it for the conference. So the solution was, what could we give them to collect all this information and present it in a nice fashion, so it's easy for the user to look at and use, and secondly, for the admins to access that information. And so this was the system that we built. And while at the same time, we were providing with notifications, reminder emails, when things were due, when they had to complete things. And so this was the landing page. They would log in, they would have access to their sponsorship level. And then based on that, they would have different deliverables. So in this, they had 6, 7 deliverables here that they would have to submit. And each one of these deliverables are all dynamic. And each time you did something, it would then present from a pending status to a completed status to an uncompleted status. So the user would know, where they are within their, submitting of information. And then secondly, the admins would also know, who completed stuff and who didn't complete stuff, so that they can be on it. So this one page does a lot of stuff. One, it gives an example of all the information that they're collecting or that they need to submit. It tells them when it's due, and then what the status of that is, and and then the reminders. And when you go into each one of them, this is some of the information we were collecting. It's a basic form, but it's all dynamic driven. And so this is all being collected in the back end. Again, the interface is very simple, easy to use. So this is, that's my last slide. Then this is the backend where the admin would come in and access all that information. They can turn on deliverables. And again, and if you don't plan this out, you get stuck, because if you didn't make this dynamic, if you statically built in your deliverables, now you're stuck at always doing static deliverables. Where if you think of it dynamically, where I can go in through a backend and build these out, now you have a more robust system, right? So this is why I say planning is so important in your development. Are there any questions? I had a question here about, can an interface compared to other applications in a competitive market be enough incentive to provide users to switch to one product to another? No. Well, I should say yes and no. I mean, obviously, your interface makes up one component of it. The application and what you're providing as a function is the other component of it. I always make this analogy. If you buy a Ferrari, you don't buy a Ferrari because it looks good and has a Topaz engine in it. You buy the Ferrari because it looks good and it's got a monster engine in it. and vice versa. You know, you don't buy a Topaz and have a Ferrari engine in it because it doesn't look good, right? So you need both. It has to look good, it has to function properly, and it has to have the engine behind it to make it robust. So, but to answer your questions, we've seen clients create systems that had a good engine, a bad UI, and we're able to win business because our UI was better, or our functionality was easier to use. Where their back end system was more complex, even though it was more robust, it was too complex to use, and the UI wasn't very good. Just a little fun note here. This is what Facebook used to look like, guys. So, just keep things in perspective, right? It all starts off from somewhere, and this is as simple as it was, became $1 billion company, right? And why was it? Because it was a simple thing. He collected information about people, and they wanted to share it between different campuses, and that allowed them to become the monster that they are today, right? So again, sometimes we think complexity is more important. It doesn't necessarily mean that your system needs to be complex. I think just simple, to the point, generating a good UI, and then of course the functionality behind that makes a world of a difference. When Facebook started, they didn't have all these algorithms and things that are happening in the background that basically analyze the person and then provide content related to that person. That's where the real fun stuff begins, right? But in your early phases of development, you got to start somewhere, and you got to start collecting information. Uh, so in this hackathon you're doing, I say, just start, with a small project, build it up, but who knows where that can lead to, right? I'm going to open up to any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. Just want to make sure I left some time here for questions. Another thing we do is if you guys have some examples you want to run through, I can help with that as well, and just maybe guide you through that process a little bit. I've been doing this quite a long time, so happy to work with you guys if that's something you want to do. No? Okay, well, again, when it comes to UI, there's many different ways that you could do this. This is one way, and I just thought I would keep it very simple and high level. I'm going to repeat again, your workflows are very, very important, and I think you should always start with that, building your application, and then start coming up with mockups and designs, and then work from there.
All right, thank you very much. If there aren't any other questions, no one has any questions? All right, everyone's very distracted with their projects, I guess. Well, thank you very much, Robert. It was really, really interesting workshop.
Yeah, a bit different than what you guys are probably used to. This is not the most technical one out there, but
oh no, well, that's precisely what made it so interesting.
Yeah. Well, I just want to point out we've been in this industry for a very long time, so we watched it evolve, right? And what's going to be fascinating to see is what's going to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, as we start advancing more and more technologies, right? I was at an event, and Intel was thinking about developing a VR experience at an NFL game where you can put a VR set and pretend you're at the game. Okay. So they had the cool process there, but what they ran into was too much data. They couldn't process that amount of data with the infrastructure that we have available to us now. So though the concept was cool, we just weren't ready for it yet. And so again, as technology advances, you guys will have more options. Maybe some new gadget like this smartphone will come out, and you could do a lot more. So, I wish you guys all the best. And if there's anything I can do to help, I'll be happy to jump in on a call.
That's great. My personal favorite part of the workshop, I think, was precisely the perspective, the historical perspective, just the evolution of the UX and UI, just like within 10 years even, and all well, if you could even call it history, it's less than 20 years old, but recent history, I guess.
That's true.
The recent historical examples and comparisons like that was definitely what interested me the most.
Yeah, well, just the introduction of the smartphone, I think about how much that changed our lives, right? When I was in this industry in the early phases of it, you couldn't access much data on your phone, right? Or you had to pay a lot of money to do that. So, nowadays you have instant information on your phone. You can instantly send information to people through your applications. That's what makes it so phenomenal right now in our day and age, right? If you're capable of figuring out a simple, like an Instagram solution or a Twitter or a Pinterest, right? You could be the next billionaire out there, right? I think everyone's trying to do that, but I mean, sometimes it's the more simpler ideas that make it out there, and a lot of times we say, "Oh, this is stupid," but nothing is stupid because the audience is so vast that what you might think is not relevant could be very relevant to a whole different audience, right?
Yeah, you could find the perfect niche somewhere.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, you think about India that has 1.3 billion people, right? If you can think of something that they can work with, you have 1.3 billion. That's more than North America combined, right? So that's a huge audience, right? So these are the ways you start thinking about ideas, right?
Yeah, definitely. I do have a question here, actually. What was the most difficult problem that you had to solve? Most difficult UX problem that you had to solve with for Icon1?
Well, just a recent one. We're currently building our own system right now, a new product line that we're launching in 2021.
All right.
And in that development, we had to figure out two different kind of user groups, right? Actually, there's several different user groups within that system. There will be some machine learning in there and AI development, but that would come later once we, again, develop the core functions and data that we're collecting. But the interesting part of what we're trying to do is you might have an audience that is dealing with a small set of data, and you might be dealing with an audience that's dealing with a large set of data. And so in the UI, we're looking at this and saying, well, if someone's working with a small set of data, you're going to have one or two lines, where someone with a large set of data might be working with, several hundred lines of line, like a list view of information. And we don't want the system to look wimpy. And so we have to find a way where we can present that data without doing it in a list view. And so that's where we came up with this concept, and it took us, several days to figure it out through our icons. So basically, let me jump into screenshot here. So we had these icons at the top here, and so for example, the list view would be something like this, right? And so this is what I mean. You'd have a lot of a lot of lines here, but some clients would only have 3 lines, and we didn't want to show just 3 lines because they look, like I said, wimpy. So we came up with a concept where, well, what if we just have them roll over and click on it from here, and now they can access that line of code or that information right from that drop down, right? So kind of like a sub drop down, without having them to click. Like I didn't have to go into that area and then click on that, right? And so I challenge my guys to say, how do I get there with just 1 click or 2 clicks, right? And from a programmer's perspective, sometimes it's hard for them to understand that. And so we have to visually show it to them, right? And once we did that, it worked out pretty well.
Huh. Yeah, there's a fine line between like the user experience and like just simply organizing the amount of data that you have. If there's a huge ton of data, one of the platforms that I think is most interesting is Smithsonian recently created a platform to present all their artifacts online because people can't actually go to the museum. And so what they did is that they made it in the form of a 3D timeline, but not just a timeline. It's also a time web, and you see the relationships between the different artifacts depending on culture, on technology, and all of that. That I found was a really brilliant um, UX design to present all the hundreds and hundreds of artifacts that they have at the museum online.
Well, I mean, a museum's a cool thing, right? I mean, you can, if you find an area that you're interested in, you want to be involved in it and learn more about it. And presenting that information can be challenging, right? Because, if you're talking about, let's say something from Egypt, you can have so much information related to it, and how do you present it, right? So I like
Yeah,
to check
yeah,
that out. I'll
definitely.
check it out after this call and see how they did that. And we're always looking at how people do UI and interfacing because it's constantly changing, right?
Yeah,
Like VR and AR, like that was another example how a new technology came in and people were all crazy about it. And we had a challenge with that, saying, well, what's the concept here? What are we trying to present? Eh? And we never got involved in it from a point of we're going to build a VR or AR experience. I do know some of our colleagues that did do that. They had some challenges with that. But again, we try and build things that you can give out to the masses, right?
yeah,
So if you can build a system that you can put many, many people on it, you have to think about several layers of your system, the multi-tenant component of it. How do you manage it? How do you manage the security component of it? How does a user access that information? And if you start getting into really cool things like AI and machine learning, well, what is the algorithm? What are you going to do with that information? And then, how do you study that user and then, hit them up with more information so it keeps them engaged. And so that's where the real cool programming part comes into play. But you got to plan that out. And that's where it goes back into that workflow of a system. And you do it in phases, right?
yeah. That would also be, I mean, the advantage of having several individuals on your team that have various backgrounds and different ways of thinking about the problem in question, because they'll each represent a specific demographic that might look at the platform or the application that you're trying to push in a different manner.
Oh, absolutely. And also keep in mind, one area that I did not really talk about was your database design, right? That is
Yeah.
very key in the development of your application. And one of my good guys on my team, Wilson, is he's key in our development. He develops the database designs because if you screw up on your database design, you have a major problem, right? And so again, when you're thinking of a complex system like the one that we're building now, a lot of effort and time was spent on understanding what are we trying to capture, because when they had to build that database design, if they did it wrong, then everything was scrap. We have to restart all over again, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so understanding the high level. This is why I say you do like these high level flowcharts if you're building a complex system, and then you break out these areas and you break like this system actually has 7 other flowcharts associated with it, by the way, but this is the high level one, and then from there you broke them up in more detail, right, to the point where we had every field mapped out, and every action mapped out. Like if you click this button, it would do that, right?
Yeah.
And then this to me was one of the better systems that we mapped out, and the development on this was so much easier because of the detail and mapping. And this took, I'd say, about a month for us to map this out with the client, right?
Mm.
Just to put it in perspective, I know you don't have a month in your hackathon, so but I mean, just keep that in mind. If you're working on more complex projects, your workflows are so important.
Would you recommend focusing on a UI and UX first planning process, or first focusing on the actual content and then sort of shaping it through the UI?
Your base is understanding what you want to build, right? So that goes back to defining your application. That's your starting point, right?
Yeah.
You need to really define what your application is going to do. So, what's the objective of your application? What are you trying to do? What do you need to collect in order for it to do that? And so, once you have that definition figured out, from there, then you start saying, okay, now how do we build it? And so, from that point on, and every application is different, right? You keep that in mind. So, um, again, that definition is the key starting point of everything. So even in this hackathon for the food bank, again, we understand you're building something for the food bank, but what is the definition of that? What are you trying to achieve? And once you can answer that, you're trying to solve a problem, right? Every system that you use is solving a problem, right? Facebook allows you to engage with the world and friends from all over the place. That solved the problem. Instagram allows you to post a picture of yourself and everything that you do that's wonderful for everyone to see, right?
Yeah.
Twitter, another, I can send out a quick tweet and everyone can see that. LinkedIn, all these things solve a problem. And so what you're ultimately trying to do is solve a problem, right? That's where the value is in anything you do, even in your small components of your system. When you're stuck and you say, how do I get to, from A to B, you're trying to solve that mini little problem, and that's where you get, fancy with your coding or your development, and you start implementing some cool features. Like the example I showed you before, where we wanted to get the user to that information in just one click, and that was the problem, and we solved it, right?
Yeah.
So I would start with your definition, and then once you have your definition, then you go into your planning of your application, and then you go into a bit of a workflow. It doesn't have to be this complicated, eh? I mean, you can go to something more simple like this, right? Like this is a simple one, right? You're collecting a bit of information, a person's approving it, an email sent out. If they approve it, yes. If they don't approve it, no, this happens, and the flow continues, right? So this is a simple workflow of a system, right? Or a
Yeah.
portion of that system.
What would you recommend to someone who is interested specifically in going into and working directly with UI in the industry?
And just wanting to design for UI, like if they want to be a
Well,
UI designer.
yeah, basically the career path they should be planning for themselves if they're interested in going into that.
I mean, look, several different avenues there. I guess depending on what you're studying in the skill set. Look, it's a bit of a dance, right? When we work with our programmers, a lot of times, like I started off as a designer, right? Like my skill set is designing.
Yeah.
Like I can't code, so I hired people that can code. That's why I can't be so technical here.
Yeah.
But when I'm working with my developers, I ask them like, what other cool features are out there? Like, what am I missing here? Like, what other functions can you give me that I can use in my UX or UI design, right? So it's a bit of understanding what's out there available to the developer or designer, or also pushing and challenging your developer to come up with some cooler functions of your system. For example, like we want to keep the footer on our systems always locked to the bottom. Doesn't matter on which screen resolution that they're in. And so, one programmer can't do it, or another one's working on it, right? And the reason why is because I want that to look and feel a certain way. I don't want to see a scroll bar. I hate scroll bars, right?
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that I maximize the width of the screen. So if a person's getting into UX and UI design, they have to understand a bit of the programming side of things, what's out there or how people are developing, and then working with programmers to know what tools they have, right, to work with in their UX design or
Yeah.
UI. A lot of times too, I'll design something and I say, guys, can we, this is what I want to see, and they're saying you're crazy, right? It's not going to happen. So, just not possible. But then, if I push them hard enough, they'll figure it out, right?
Yeah. Actually,
But
this okay. This
I would study designs. I would look. When you look at large companies like Facebook, these big guys out there, they're spending millions of dollars in development, right? So you don't have access to that, but what you can do is reverse engineer what they're doing, looking at what they're doing, and that's a great avenue to learn, right? That's why I
yeah
say research is so important. Research the big boys and see how they're doing it, and say, wow, because when you look at that little tool that they built, that's like hundreds of hours of them researching and thinking it out, and now you can see it and say, I'm going to reverse engineer that and use it for my system, and that helps you, right? And then you add your tweak to it, right?
yeah. Well, in that case, for the participants, that would be a great idea. Don't forget to try and maybe do a little research on similar apps and platforms that are out there.
For sure, right?
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you. A lot of times we research our competitors, and I can't say too many good things about some of the things I saw, but in some cases they did have some really cool things. It wasn't presented very well, but the information that they were collecting or that module that they built was something that we were missing, and we're like, hey, we're missing that. But if we take that kind of concept and develop it into our tool, and then also make it function the way we want, we have an advantage because their system was clunky, right? It looked archaic.
Yeah.
I'm very big on look and feel and simplicity, but we need to have that engine behind it, right? So
Yeah. Well, that would be the designer background.
exactly, yes. Yeah.
But I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, humanity, no one's going to have a great idea to start off with. You always have to base yourself on something else, and there's always room for improvement. And it's not always you that's going to find that improvement, but you can always work with that.
Well, exactly, and I'm going to just remind you, this is what Facebook started off as, right? That
Yeah.
Facebook. So, I mean, imagine that, right? 2005, or when was this up? Yeah, looks like 2004, whatever. Point being is, you look at Facebook or Instagram and you say, "Holy smokes, I can never do it." Don't ever say that, because this guy started like this, right? Mark just
Yeah.
started like this, and it was a very simple concept. And so start simple and then expand on it. What's great is you guys are coming into a time period where there's just so many different tools out there, right? We were
Yeah.
limited in our tools. I remember in 2001, we were thinking about mapping out traffic, so you knew, because I hated traffic, right? I'm like, there's got to be a better solution to this. But the technology wasn't there. The GPS wasn't there on everyone's phones, right? So it wouldn't work. So we were too early, I guess, maybe in some of our ideas, unfortunately. So, right.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, but that's what's great about hackathons. Like you guys, you don't the participants. You guys don't have to necessarily have everything in place. The goal is the idea, and you work towards the ideal that you come up with.
Yeah, or it's a good starting point, right?
Yeah.
And what's great about hackathons is you have a time limit on it, and so you have to be very smart with your time and your thought process. When you have unlimited time, I guess with enough time you'll figure it out, right?
Yeah.
But with only 36 hours, you have to be very smart with your time, and that goes back to your workflows and planning. If you don't, this is where you just start with the brainstorming. Brainstorm a little bit, talk about what you think would be a cool concept and how that's going to work, and what are you trying to solve, and then after you map it out as quickly as possible because you have limited time. But if you're is it a groups of 4 or 5 that are doing? How's that work? The hackathon?
Right now, it's teams are max 4.
Max 4. So in a team of 4, then everyone breaks out to develop their individual concept, but you have to know how each parts come together. So essentially what you're doing is you're multiplying 36 hours by 4 people, right? So it gives
Yeah.
you more time. So, but if each person is working on the same thing, then you're losing that time. And so this is where that problem solving component of this is very important, right? if you plan it properly and each person breaks out and does that component, and, well, hey, first you got to know how to stitch the pieces together, make sure that they work together, and so you have to plan that part out. But again, you're multiplying 36 hours by 4, right? Which is good.
Yeah.
So it's a lot more time if you think about it.
Yeah. I do have one other question here. I was personally, I was wondering what is your personal process when you are presented with something that when a client comes to you with a problem that they're asking you to solve, how do you go about that?
Well, look, I mean, over the years, we've seen a lot of different type of clients, right?
Yeah.
You have different type of people that understand. Then you have unrealistic clients, right, where they think that you can, you're Disney World and you can make things happen. And so a lot of times is also managing the expectations of your clients, right? And I'm being honest about this because as a developer or a programmer, or if one day you can have a company, you have to manage those expectations. So when they come and say, this is the problem, this is what we're trying to do, you take it, great, let's take a look at that. You study the solution, you think of ideas, you engage with them. You have to ask a lot of questions. How does this work? You have to understand your users, and you can't let them dictate. You can't, like sometimes you run into people like, well, this is what I want. Well, look, in order for me to do my job, I need to understand. So I'm going to ask these questions. And so the more information you can gather from them, and I'm going to go back to that workflow that I was showing you earlier. This was a bit of a complex solution that we had to build. And what was great about it was this client was fantastic. They brought in all their stakeholders, right? So this is a very large organization. So you had multiple stakeholders. So if you're dealing with a large organization, you want to deal with all the proper stakeholders, because if one person's missing, then after that person's going to come in at the end of your preparation and say, no, I don't want it that way. And then your whole thing is out the door. So in setting up is making sure you have all your stakeholders, understanding what they want to do, and presenting a solution. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of times we can solve it. Like there's very few things that you can't do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, unless they ask me to build a rocket ship, then I'll just say, go talk to Elon Musk, right? But you're talking to the wrong guy. As long as it's within your capabilities, you're fine, right?
Yeah. Well, I assume sometimes you've had to make certain sacrifices. You would have preferred to design something a certain way, but the client, the client sort of twisted your arm in that sense.
All the time. A lot of times we present all the time. No, I'll be honest with you. We will present a solution and they'll say, no, I want it like this, or two people might decide on it differently. And so at some point or another, you have to give in, right? Because if they're paying, and you can, well, you can make the recommendation as long as you said, hey, this is our recommendation, this is what I think you should do. And if they're fine with not listening to your recommendation and moving forward with their idea of a solution, then you hold them accountable for it, right?
Yep.
The worst case is when you have a client, like I said, that is not reasonable, and then changes things in mid-cycle. So one thing I didn't touch on is, when you're developing this workflow becomes your scope of work, right?
Yeah.
The SOW. So if you're down the road, if someone hires you to build something, you will look at this scope of work and say, okay, this is going to take 200 hours or 30 hours or whatever. And they would sign off on this scope of work. And then you would bill them for your hours and time to develop it. Now, you hold them accountable to that, because if they change anything in that scope of work, you can say, sorry, this is outside the scope of work. And so you can bill more. And I made that error a lot of times in the early phases of my business. We didn't have a clear, defined scope of work, and people got away with adding so much stuff. And we just wanted to keep the client happy, but I did a lot of free work in that process, right?
Yeah.
So from a business perspective, I can say, it's very important to have a clear scope of work, from a programming perspective, then from a billing perspective, and you keep your clients accountable, right? So if they change anything, they can come back and say, oh, that's not what I wanted, right?
Yeah.
That's where the mockups come in play too, right? Because when we do mockups, we present them. This is how your system's going to look. And we don't just do one mockup. We do like every part of the system, right? So they see exactly how it's going to look.
Yeah.
And usually 99% of whatever we mock up is what they're getting, right?
Yeah. In that case, if you do so many mockups, I assume that that's basically towards the end of the work. You just have to patch it together, right? How long does that take in the process?
Mockups can, again, depending on the system, we can spend a week on it, 2 weeks. The application we're building for ourselves, it took me, because it was my system and I was building it, I knew everything inside how I wanted it. It took me, roughly a week, but then it took me another 2 weeks to kind of work out all the little parts of that system, right?
Yeah.
With our programmers. When you stitch it together, like you're saying is things slowly come to play, right? You just figure it out, right? So, and the other part about this is that as you're developing these mock-ups, you don't know all the solutions, right? When we presented it to someone to look at, we did some A/B testing. They came back to us and said, "No, it would be cooler if you did this, or you're missing that." So then you go back to your mock-up and you add it, right? And then you start developing the system. Actually, in this case, what we actually did is there was a component of our system, the core component of it, that regardless of the mockup, we had to build it. So the developers went to bat and started building that piece because without that piece, I didn't have a system. So I had to figure out, can they do it? And once they figured out that they can do it, then I was able to figure out, work on the remaining component of my system. So if there are some question marks in your system, you might want to figure out those pieces first, because if you can't figure it out, you might not have a system, right?
Yeah. Okay, well, I have one more maybe loftier question.
Sure.
But what do you see what do you see how do you see the future of like the UX industry as a whole?
I don't know. It depends, right? Different user groups, right? Younger generation might expect a different kind of UX UI design versus an older generation, right? I don't think you can sum it up into one component, right? It's when you think of, let's say, the masses, one shoe does not fit all, right? You got to think of all the different scenarios, and you'll never figure that out. But certainly we are moving towards, and we have moved towards instant access, right? I want to see 3 clicks, 3 buttons. I want to see the information immediately. People don't want to waste time looking for something. I don't care if it's fancy. I just want to get to my info, right?
Oh yeah.
Because we all live in a very quick, fast-paced environment, and you probably don't realize it in a lot of things that you guys use. You really need to pay attention to some of these apps that you're using and seeing just how quickly they are and how fast you can use it because you're programmers. So, they simplify the application, and then there's all these processes behind it. But I think UX UI design is going to just get simpler and simpler. And as we get into more data transfer, you're going to be able to see and do more. YouTube, for example, only became available once we were able to get to accessing more data, right, through our phones. Or else it was a dead platform. There was platforms before YouTube, but when YouTube came into play at the right time, and that's a very important component, timing, right? More than money that you need to develop things, timing can be so key in your application. YouTube came out at the exact perfect time for it to be accepted because your phone was, allowing you to watch YouTube on it, and data was easier accessible. You weren't paying, for 5 megabytes, or 100 megabytes. You're getting gigs now, right?
Yeah.
And you needed that to watch a video. And then compression also was another component of that. They figured out how to do proper compression to make that video file size much smaller, right?
Yeah. Well, sometimes just everything falling into place at the right time.
Yeah, there was a good TED talk about applications, about timing versus money. versus programmers. And when the guy broke it down, it came down to timing was one of the most important aspects of launching a system. Instagram, if you think about it, smartphones, going back to that example, right? Without this, Instagram doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
So if they were thinking that idea many years prior to this, it would have been a dead idea. But they realized that they came out at the right time, right?
Yeah.
So
Well,
I would keep an eye on technology, right? Especially as we get into 5G. You're going to be able to access more information on your phones much quicker. So who knows what that leads to, right? You may be able to plug something into your phone and have instant VR at a football game. I don't know, right? So that could be where we're headed, right?
yeah, and hopefully we'll shape how we're headed.
Sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry. Hopefully we'll shape how we're headed as well.
Oh, I hope so. You're the next generation, so I really look forward to seeing what you guys do, right? Again, the young generation, creative, look to the past, right? That's why I did this little document in the past, because the past will show you where the future might be. And so, whatever you guys develop, you could be the next Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or whoever, right? So you just gotta get your heads into the game and start developing stuff that people might want.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Robert.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you once again for having me. And if there's any questions after this, I'll be happy to answer them.